I actually forgot to start the recording. So we have the recording for today's study group. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the link to the lab guide in the chat room. So if anyone's joining for the first time, just grab that link, and then you'll have the study guide on your end. But if you don't have an environment already set up, then obviously you might just want to watch me today, and then just go back later, and you can complete these labs whenever you like. So in that study guide, kind of like a starting point is this March 17th. The February 24th talks about getting like your accounts. Like if you don't already have a Cisco account, it'll explain here's how you get a Cisco and create an account. Then you can use that account in the DevNet sandboxes, which is one of the resources that we utilize for our hands-on labs. Other ones would be in Red Hat, but most of the Red Hat labs would not require you to have a particular like customer account, which you probably want to do that if you want to go a step further and leverage some of our evals, as well as a developer license where you can have like a lot of free access to Red Hat Enterprise Linux and to Ansible automation platform for like up to like, I think it's like up to like 20 devices. And you can do all of that for free using a developer license. So some of that information is kind of in, it's included in this first session here, which also has a video on YouTube if you want to go back and listen to that one that explains like how to set all that stuff up. But normally where we return is on the March 17th. What it does is it has some steps to get you up and running with the particular environment that we're using today, which is the DevNet environment. So I've already done some of these things. I went and I reserved a DevNet sandbox, and I went ahead and cloned down a repo that includes some scripting, so that way I can build out my environment in this Cisco sandbox. And one of the things that I also need to have is a GitLab user account. So we use GitLab in this study group, so that way we can save our configurations as code. So every time that we make changes, we'll update our own repo at the end of the lab. So that way, when we continue on to the next lab, we continue to have that code available for us, which the code would be like the playbooks or templates or really any other files that we're using that would complement what we're doing in the labs. So it's very important to save those. Otherwise, you may have to do some rework because some of these labs do build on each other because we're kind of like adding to the labs and taking advantage of some of the inventories and other constructs that we built in the past so that we don't have to keep, reproducing them over and over again. So, so that's why we have the repo. So in this particular one, it has some examples of how to go through that. So once you go through that process, you kind of, you'll wind up at a point where I am right now. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to today's topic. I might have went too far down. It's like right above the advertisements. Yeah, so I got to scroll up to today. So today is the July 13th section where we're going to talk about loops. And then I do have a reminder about the March 17th, to go back and set up your lab and so on and so forth. So where I'm at right now, I have a DevNet sandbox. And in my sandbox, I have this thing called a CML, which is a simulator. So the reason why I'm using the Cisco modeling labs is so I can spin up various routers in a topology. So here I have actually some switches and some routers. I have some Nexus switches, the disk-switch 01 and 02. And then I have two iOS XE routers that are distribution routers. And then I have a core router at the top of the topology. So this is a topology that's included in the repo that you clone down as part of those steps. So once you have your Cisco modeling labs, you can just go into it and add that topology, and you can turn off the existing topology. So just a quick recap here. This is the default topology in their sandbox. This is running by default, so I go in and I turn it off. So you can just click off right here, and that turns off the entire topology. And then this is the one that I import. So this is the Ansible4Networking. And this is the topology that we're using. And then to get to that point, what I had to do is go over here to import, and then I find it on my local device. So it's this one right here, this Ansible4Networking.yaml. And then I import it in, which I've already done, so no need to do that again. And then once it's there, I can just simply turn it on, which I've already done. So I'm at that point where I have a working topology. The second part of using the Cisco DevNet is the jump box. So they have a Linux box that they call the dev box, which is effectively a jump box. And I can access that through a VPN tunnel. The VPN tunnel credentials are emailed to you from Cisco. So you go in and configure a VPN. And then once you have the VPN connection, you have direct access to these devices such that the IP addressing is always the same. Once connected to the VPN, you always have this 10.10.20 subnet, and you can bookmark, the various things that you have to connect to. So from a Linux perspective, I have this jump box, right? So I already ran the setup scripting. So you see, like, it installed a bunch of different versions and fixed my Python and things like that. So that takes about like 3 or 4 minutes. So just note that you have to kind of let that run in the beginning. And then once that finishes, I'll have what we call my project available for me. And I'm going to have to SSH back into that one. It looks like the connection stopped on me. SSH. Developer is the username at 10.10.20.50. And that IP address, again, is always the same for the jump box. And the password is always capital C1SCO12345. And again, Cisco sends you all this information with your credentials to log into VPN. So now I'm in this jump box, and you can see that I have this folder here is from cloning it down. And this has my scripting and other files that you need to get started, like that topology file for the CML, so that you can build your lab, as well as this My Project. So this My Project is my working project in GitLab. So in the instructions, it'll tell you how to set up your own, and then to make sure that you save your files every time and go through some Git commands so that way you commit them and then push them back into your GitLab repository. And then they're there waiting for you, the next time you return to the lab. So I'm going to change directories into my project. And you can see I have all these, various lab files from previous labs. So now I'm at a starting point where I can open up my lab guide. And let me bring this over to the side so you can see both at the same time. And I'll move this over a little bit like that. Right, so here we are, and we're talking about loops. So if you're familiar with really any programming language, right, then constructs like loops are definitely needed so that you can iterate through items. So Ansible is no exception. There's instances where we're not just building the one thing or the one element. So it's necessary for us to be able to iterate through our task and our playbook with various variables. And the variables are populating parameters, so we're just iterating through them. And there's different techniques that are used in looping depending on what we're trying to accomplish. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about basic loops, and then we will talk about a bit more of an advanced loop, which is the with dictionary loop. But that's about as far as we're going to go. We're just going to go through some examples, and we'll continue to circle back on this topic, over and over again, because there's so many different scenarios and different use cases that we can apply loops to. So this is just, effectively a starting point for us to, to get started and to become familiar. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create this playbook here. So because we're working from a terminal, then normally I'll just copy and paste to save a little bit of time because I'm a slow typer anyway. And I'll use the Vim editor. Now, if you're working like locally, you could use your VS Code and then have an SSH connection, into your sandbox. And all those things do work. So feel free to do whatever makes sense for you. But to keep it simple, I'm just going to use the Vim editor here. So I'll go ahead and create this new playbook, which is going to be called loop_ping.yaml. And then so that I can insert the data or insert the text. And you can see I have the startings of a playbook. Now, just to walk through the taxonomy of a playbook, like obviously we give it a name. This is a, if you're just starting here and are not that familiar with YAML, this is a YAML file. And then the 3 dashes here, or 3 ticks, are indicative of a playbook. So it's the start of the playbook. The dash name is the name of the playbook. Typically, that is required, and it should be, as a best practice, it should explain, what you're accomplishing. What is the purpose of the playbook? So in this case, we're just going to do a ping test. Host points to groups or individual hosts in your inventory. So if you're not familiar with inventories, you can go back. We've had whole sections of study guide sessions on that particular topic. So you can go back and look at them on the YouTube channel. But effectively, the inventory is how we point to our targeted devices, right? So in this case, I'm pointing to a group that's called core-router01. And then the task is where we call a module. So in this case, we're calling the iOS ping module. That's a part of a Cisco iOS collection. Collections are installed. In this case, the way that we're using Ansible, we're installing it directly into this Linux virtual machine. But those could also be as part of an execution environment, which is a container, which we've also covered that in previous topics. And we'll go over that again, where we use the Ansible Navigator as an alternative to just Ansible Playbook directly from the Ansible core engine, like running it locally on your device. The Navigator is another way, another tool, but it's leveraging a container as opposed to installing those collections, on the device globally or into a virtual environment. So at the end of the day, the outcome is the same. It's just how you're accessing, modules and collections. And then the AAP, the Ansible Automation Platform, the GUI, then that is also using execution environment. So that's a container that ultimately that's where the collections are, where they are installed. And that's where you're leveraging them as you're running these jobs that are running your job templates or your workflow templates. Those playbooks that are being called are, running in an execution environment. So the Ansible core engine is either installed in an execution environment container, or it's installed directly on your device, or in a virtual environment where you set up a Python virtual environment. But the way that you create your playbooks is all the same, right? So regardless how you use Ansible, the playbooks are the same. So we're using iOS ping module that's a part of this Cisco collection. And then what we want to do is we want to ping more than one destination. So we are going to use this item to create a placeholder to iterate through that loop for the parameter DEST, or destination, right? So this is where we're going to ping to. So we could have like a static entry here, right? But instead of that, we're going to iterate through a loop. So if I were to save this at this point, you're probably wondering, if you're kind of looking into it, it's probably not going to work, right? But I wanted to kind of do it this way just to show you a little bit more of the how the mechanics of all this works under the hood. So we do have a loop, and you can see that the loop itself, like over here, is calling destinations, right? Which is the name of a list element, right? But we haven't really explicitly said where that is. So what'll happen is if we run this playbook, which we will, so I'm just going to copy this out here, and I'm going to run it over here. And this will happen all the time where, hey, you have a variable that's undefined. In this case, it's, this is the name, or this is where we're pointing to the list element in our loop, right? And it's undefined. So we need to define that. So what we need to do is add the variable somewhere. So one place that we can add variables, and I've talked about this too on previous sessions, is that there's a whole list of like different locations where we can include variables. That could be in the inventory, group variables, host variables, variable files, or variables in the playbook. And that's what we're going to do here, is we're going to add variables in the playbook. The second part about variables that's a bit more complicated is there's also a precedence, right? So depending on where the variable is, it may override the same variable somewhere else, because it's a higher precedence depending on where it is. Extra variables having the highest, so they just override everything else, and it just kind of works its way down. And we have some documentation in this lab guide too that'll show you like what would overrule what variable, what order precedence would win and that type of stuff. So having said that, I'm going to add this into my playbook, and I need to know where to put it, where it should be located so that it'll run properly. So I'm going to go back into here, and where I need it is above the task and under the host here. So these are variables that'll be available for the entire play of the playbook. Just gotta, hopefully my indentation's okay once it comes in, which it's not. So let me just fix this up real quick. This will not work, right? Because this is a YAML file, so it's sensitive to the indentation. So I need to move that over, move that over, move that over. So now we have some IPs that we can ping in our lab environment. So I need to save this playbook and then rerun this playbook. It's taking its sweet time here. Another thing I have to do is just make sure everything's on in here. Yeah, it looks like they're all on and connected and all that good stuff. Oops. Well, it should time out here in a second and tell us why it's not connecting. Oh, here we go. It just took an extremely long time. So we were actually able to ping those endpoints. It just took a while to either for the ping to finish or for them to connect to those devices. I think there's a question coming in. Yes, Williams?
Item is a built-in variable, right? Because it's built-in, it's a key value. The variable item.
Yes, and you can change that.
So
it's just a placeholder, right? So you could change item, like you could go into your loop, and under the loop you could change item to something else, but that's just the default one that we use. It's just item. It's just a placeholder.
So what happens if you use, say, just change it to anything? Because I think I've tried it and it didn't work.
You should be able to do it in the under loop parameter. So you can change it there. So like in the playbook itself, if I want to use something other than item, then I can go under here. Oops. And it's loop, it's not loop label. It's loop, it might be loop. Hold on, let me see that real quick.
Oh, you actually have
control,
to put in.
That's right.
You actually have to put in a different. Okay, no, okay. I was just changing that variable. Okay.
So you could do loop control label, and then you could change it to something else, whatever you want. And actually, you will have like some in AAP. You'll see it sometimes where it'll say that item's already being used. It'll give you like a warning to change it to another name because you're running like more than one loop at the same time.
Okay.
So we could change it to whatever.
Okay.
But the idea is like, it's the placeholder. You're really like destinations is the actual values that you're going to iterate through, or key values that you're going to iterate through. I mean, because it's a list element. So yeah. Let me get back to I have it open over here. Yeah, so we can name loops whatever we want. So that's just another parameter to set for the label. Okay, so good question though. So you don't have to use all these defaults. So the next thing is, let's do another loop scenario. Escape, Control Z. All right, so in this one here, we're going to work with some interfaces. And again, I just want to save time, a little bit of time here. And what am I calling this one? Loop interfaces. Okay, looks like that one came out pretty clean. So this time around, you can see here that we're using the iOS_interfaces module. And it has this config parameter. And the config parameter would accept a dictionary. So if you go to the documentation, you can see all the parameters like fit underneath config, or at least most of the parameters do. There's also the state and some other ones that are like further down. That are at the same level, so they're not in that dictionary. But in config, there's a lot of things that you can configure, and you could just pull in like that entire dictionary. But if you wanted to iterate through it with a loop, then you could do it this way. And again, it's just using the default item, but we could change that to something else as the placeholder. But in this one here, we haven't explicitly said where interfaces is, but this one's actually going to work. And then I'll explain how it worked after we run it. So it's like, how is this one different? All right, so it's loop interfaces. So how did it know where to find these key values for name and description? Does anyone have an idea? So the answer here is the first one that we looked at, those variables did not exist anywhere. So we had to explicitly add those IP addresses for the destinations. This one actually did work, and it's a linkage back to what I mentioned earlier, where you can have variables set, and Ansible will actually go and search through them in different locations. So what we actually had, or what I have here, and what you would have too if you completed some of the previous labs, like leading up to this point, is we do have some files already in our project. And you'll notice here we have a directory called group vars. So if I take a look in the group vars, and we were on like the one for the core router group. And if I tab through there, you can see there's an interfaces.yaml in there. So if I open that up, you can see that here I do have this list element name interfaces, right, that has this list of names and descriptions. So I can read those in from this particular file. And the reason why we can read them in is because we're calling a group called core-router01, or actually the host is core-router01. And it's in a group that's called core-router, right? So how that works is in the inventory, right? Because I've created an inventory in the past. An inventory is called inventory.yaml. And if we look in here, or up here rather, we have the core-router group, and it has a host called core-router01. So even though I'm pointing to the router, Ansible is well aware of what group that router is in, and it will look for group variables and host variables. And actually, the first place it would look would be in here, because some of these have some variables in them. Like, so if you look at this iOS group, it has some variables that are defined here in the inventory. So this would be the first location that Ansible would look. But this particular group that we've called in our playbook doesn't have any variables defined here other than the Ansible host. So it will then look in group vars in that folder. So that's what it did, is it went and it located or identified that there is a core router folder, which maps back to that group. And it goes inside that folder and it can find interfaces.yaml. And then that actually happened to be the key values that would, provide for those parameters that we have in our playbook, which was name and description. So that's how that one worked. So that one was pretty easy. So if you have group variables or host variables, then they're there, they're accessible to Ansible, and then you can use them, in this case, for a loop. And interfaces right here, and then interfaces was in here, right here. And then here's our list. So pretty straightforward, pretty useful. Now we're going to look at a bit more complicated scenario. So I'm going to have to create a couple of new files, right? So in this one, we're also looking at interfaces, but we're doing it in a different way. So I'm going to create a new playbook again. And this one, I say it's a bit more advanced, even though it's still kind of basic, because with dictionary, you can do a lot of fancy things that are more complicated than a typical loop. So we'll just take a look at what the with dictionary can add us, or can do for us, I mean, what it adds for us. So I want to call this one advanced loop. I paste. Looks like everything's okay here. So this time, I'm just printing out information on the screen. So I need that data available for me. So right now, we really haven't said how we're going to locate the interface underscore data. But we do know we are going to key into the inventory underscore host name in this case, because we're talking about the core dash router 01 group. We have that single router in there. Or actually, this is the host itself. So we're actually already pointing to just the host. So that host is the inventory host name. But if we called a group here, then it would iterate through however many hosts are in that group. And we can use this variable inventory underscore host name, which is one of Ansible's magic variables. It's already there that we can use for our purposes. It's one of the known variables, also just like the the facts and the like that we can call on and use them as a part of our variables for our conditionals or whatever else when we're calling loops and things like that. So with this one, we're using with dictionary, and the dictionary will be defined in this interface underscore data. And then we're looking for a dictionary for each one of the hosts. In this case, it's just the one host. All right, and we're going to print that out in the screen. And what we're going to print out is key value. So we'll iterate through the keys and the values. So this is different than what we did earlier. So I'll go ahead and set this one up. So the first thing that we need is we have to create the interface dash data YAML file and put some data in there. So let me escape. Why is that not working? Maybe I didn't click in it. Good old Vim. All right, so this one is interface data, but I need to put it in vars. Do I even have a vars yet? Let me make that directory just in case. Vars dash. Let's see, interface data. .yaml. All right, so now we'll go ahead and add some data in here. And you'll notice this data is set up a little bit differently than the last time. This data structure is different than the data structure that we were using in that iOS module for interfaces. So this time we've created kind of like our own data structure, right? So we will call this dictionary from interface underscore data. And then in here we have the list element. So it's sort of like what we would see, in that data structure that we used for the module, but it is a little bit different. So here we need to point to this, which happens to be the host name of the router. Hence, when we go back into here, you can see that we have interface data with the host name. So interface data, right? Because this is like parsing through the data, right? So interface data points to interface data here. And then inventory host name is the variable placeholder, and it'll pull in this. The actual host is the core-router 01. So then we point here, and then we have access to these list elements, to configure our device. Or in this case, we're not configuring device. We just want to print out what the configuration is on the screen. So we're using debug. So debug is a module where we can print the screen output or the standard output on the screen. And that's what we're doing this time around. Hopefully that makes sense. So with these two together, I'm still missing something, right? So if I run this playbook right now, it's just like it was the first time. We were missing where the variables were. Because even though we have that group variable, but it's not in the correct data structure, it won't work. It's not called interface dash or interface underscore data, right? So it's never going to use it. It's called interfaces. So that one, it's not, Ansible's going to be unable to find this until we explicitly point to it. So just to prove that point, I'm going to just run the playbook real quick. Right? So this is undefined interface underscore data. Now, if we told it in the playbook to point to interfaces, then that would be a different story. But we do not know, Ansible does not know at this point how to access this. So in this case, we're going to use the ability to point directly to a variable file. So here we're explicitly telling Ansible where to look for interfaces, or interface underscore data is in the interface dash data.yaml that I created previously. So we just have to take it and copy it and modify the playbook, which is called advanced underscore loop. And we'll put it again in the play area. So any of the tasks would have access to it. Depending on where you put it in the playbook, is a scope for where the variable can be used. If you put it like under task, it would only be available for, this part of the play. So it just depends on where these are located, kind of the scope of where they have, or where the playbook would have access to it. So in this case, the entire play would find this data. So here, now it knows where to go, and then we'll be able to run the playbook at this point. And we should print out those key values that are in, this structure, this data structure. Right, so here we have the name is the key, right? Key, name, value, gigabit Ethernet, and it's just going to iterate through all of them. It's just working its way down. And then sometimes the key is description, right? So every other one is the description. So name and description. So the next one's description. For gigabit Ethernet 1 is management. So it's management. So we're just iterating through this data structure, which was slightly different than what we had in our group vars. And also, Ansible was unaware of where it was because it didn't exist anywhere in the default locations. So having said that, that's as deep as I wanted to go today. Or actually went a little bit longer than I had anticipated. But what I do now is I would save my work. So this is just to call this out. If you go through these labs, just make sure you follow the steps at the end. So that way you save your work and commit it and push it into the repository. So the next time that you open up my project, and after you clone it down, run the setup script and clone it down from your GitLab repository, which you can create a free account for, then you'll have all of your changes available, the next lab section that you're working on. So that's all that I have for today. Thank you for those that stayed on. Again, these are recorded, so if you ever are on one you have to drop, or if you're unable to make it, just go to the YouTube channel that we have, which is actually I posted the link to that channel in this chat room. And as well as we have a Discord, for anyone that has questions on the labs and all that stuff. You can either find the links in the meetup group if you go into the meetup group, and those links are there in kind of like the main page, and also in the events I'll put the recordings and that kind of stuff. So you can always return to a past event and get them there, or go to Discord. Either place I'll have all of the artifacts from that particular study group and also from the topics at hand. So before I jump off real quick, does anybody have any questions or anything before we drop off today? All right. Well, thanks again for joining, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care.